Yes,
Great.
it will be.
Thank you. Okay, so let's get this started. So yes, as Con mentioned, the idea for today was to have two parts here, but I added a little bit at the end to try to start that connection with remote sensing. I was going to cover mostly the aspects of flux data and preparing flux data to be used with remote sensing, and what are some of the key aspects that you have to look into when using these flux data. And I'll try to make that that connection towards the end, and we can jump into more of the remote sensing next week with Nicola. All right, so getting this going. So just to define a little more precisely what I mean by flux data, I'm going to talk about the FLUXNet data products more specifically. And I'm treating only three sources here of this FLUXNet data products. They are mainly the FLUXNet2015 product that was made available a while ago, and the products now being published by the ONEFlux network and by the ICOS ETC Center, the Ecosystem Thematic Center, and the European database. So the idea is for this product to start being distributed by other networks as well. And ONEFlux and ICOS are the two that have that started already. And I'm going to just point to two sources of documentation here for this data product, for this FLUXNet data products. There's this paper from 2020 where we documented all the details about the organization of the data set, how the processing happens, how the ONEFlux pipeline is implemented, and how we use ONEFlux to generate these FLUXNet data products. And we're, by the way, we're trying to coalesce around this naming for the product. So FLUXNet data products are all compatible with these with this processing scheme. So these products should all be they can be combined and can be used together. I'm going to mention this briefly next. We also had quite a bit of feedback mentioning that there are some complexities to using this data product. There are a lot of variables, and sometimes it's a little hard to get started with the product. So we prepared this quick start guide, and this is also available in the FLUXNet website. And as I mentioned, all this documentation is the same reference documentation for the FLUXNet data products has been distributed. The original FLUXNet 2015, the ONEFlux FLUXNet product, the ICOS ETC FLUXNet product, they are all the same, and they can be used in combination. So just to detail a little bit more what these three different sources have right now in terms of data availability. So the FLUXNet 2015 product has 212 sites. This is a map showing those sites. And a couple of years ago, we managed to change the data use terms to be more precise and adopted this CC by 4 data policy, which is being adopted by all of the regional networks as a standard way to tell us how we should proceed to use these data and how to acknowledge the usage and how to cite the sources. So all of this information is being now made consistent across all the networks. And for the FLUXNet 2015 product, we have 206 sites available under this policy. And I'm going to walk you through just a little bit how to get these data, because the platforms are a little different for each of these sources. So I'm going to try to give you some pointers here. So the FLUXNet 2015 data set, you can get it at the fluxnet.org website. And basically, when you go to download data, to the download data link, you will see this interface here. And basically, the choice that you have is between the CC by 4 data that I mentioned and what we call tier 2 data, which includes 6 additional sites. So the tier 2 data includes all sites, but has more restricted data usage. So if you choose to include these additional 6 sites, even if you end up only using sites that are CC by 4, you will have to follow the tier 2 policy. So pay attention to this small detail. It might be important when working up your data analysis. Just looking now at the sites that are available via the UniFlux data portal. This is the UniFlux FLUXNet product. So right now we have 79 sites. And I forgot to mention, but FLUXNET2015 went up to 2014 only, and all of the updated products are being made available in the regional network side. So data for UniFlux now goes up to 2021, and we're working up the site processing to include 2022 data already. And we have 79 sites, and the data download here, there are a few other products that you can download from the UniFlux data download page, but basically you just have to select the UniFlux FLUXNet product to have access to these sites that are processed in this way with the ONEFlux pipeline. Now for the IQOS product, there are a couple of versions of products that were made available. So if you go to the IQOS Carbon Portal website, you can search for these different data sets. And what you want to do is, under the data type, you want to select a couple of these different products that are available. So I will mention 2 that are still current and can be used. One is this effort that was put together for this warm winter 2020 study that was conducted, and this product includes 77 sites and data up to 2020. And if you just search for FLUXNet product under data type, you will find all of these data sets listed. A second round of processing was made available more recently with data up to 2021, and this includes 46 sites. And to find those still under data type, you just use etc L2 FLUXNet as your search term, and you should see all of these sites listed and ready to download. So the idea with these distribution platforms is to have a platform that is available for each regional network covering their own data distribution needs. And we are working on a way to automate the gathering of the data from all of these different portals, so you can have, again, a single point of entry to access global data sets. And for that, it is important to note that this CC by 4 policy is super important because it allows us to do something like that. So just looking broadly at the data availability for the site. So here I'm combining the availability for all of these different rounds of processing, all these different versions of the data product that are available. So FLUXNet 2015 had 212 sites, and then we have 79 sites that were processed for UniFlux, 77 plus 46 for IQOS. And these rounds of processing have some overlap. So just combining all of these different versions, removing the duplications, we have a total now of 220 sites that are available with this FLUXNet data product, over 2,600 site years of data. And you can see the distribution of sites that have data for each year in blue in the graph on the top here. And a more detailed, although not really readable at this scale, but the availability of data for all of the sites that are included here. So going from 1991, that's the first year that we have data for fluxes in the networks, all the way to 2022. So you can have a kind of heat map idea of what data is available to be used. So what is this FLUXNet data product? So some of you might be familiar with that as well, but I just wanted to cover a little bit of what is included and what are the important pieces of this product. So basically, the FLUXNET product is what is being generated by running the ONEFlux pipeline. So this pipeline is represented in this workflow here. It is an open source software. It's available on GitHub. We're still working out the full mode of operating in this open source mode of development. So we're working up to that. But it is available. Anyone can download and check out how it works. And these are just the major steps of the processing. I will go into detail of a couple of these steps that are important when you're preparing to use this data set. But just to give you a broad idea of what this processing involves. And I will mention here the carbon fluxes, and this is just a very short example to highlight what's included here as a product. So starting from the measured NEE at the top. So this is kind of the starting point of the processing for the ONEFlux product. Then we have process for doing gap filling. So basically just adding the data to the gaps that are gaps in the data. And we do a partitioning of these carbon fluxes of net ecosystem exchange into ecosystem restoration and gross primary production. So those are kind of, it's part of this main line of processing in the pipeline here. And another aspect that is really important for this processing is this addition of measures or estimates, I should say, estimates of uncertainty associated with these products. So for NEE, it's a little hard to see, but I just added here a little bit of an area of uncertainty there. But also for respiration and GPP, we have these uncertainties that are being estimated, propagated through all of these products. And I'm going to mention how you can take those into account when doing your data processing. So this is the main source of uncertainty for CO2 fluxes is turbulence conditions, right? If there's not enough turbulence, the edge covariance method will not work. So we use this approach of estimating a threshold of friction velocity of U star to allow us to evaluate when we have enough turbulence to have the edge covariance method working. Now, this method depends a lot on what data is available. So we are using this bootstrapping approach to try to cover a good range of conditions that could arise at the site. So for each site, we are generating these 200 versions of the U star threshold. We apply that and we select the 40 percentiles, and these 40 percentiles are actually propagated throughout the pipeline. So we generate 40 versions of all of these products throughout the pipeline. And basically at the end, we, as a final product, we provide 7 percentiles for each of these products. And we also provide a few other shortcuts that I will mention briefly. So what does this look like in the data? So here I'm just showing some of these columns and what you will see when opening these files for your analysis. So you have the timestamps there, and you have these shortcut versions. So the reference, I'll explain this a little bit more. We have quality control flags that you can use to filter the data. I'm going to mention a little bit about those too. And we have versions that are specific to one version of the U star, just the median U star. So this is also propagated throughout the pipeline, so we can do some diagnostics, and it's useful for doing some analysis as well. And the mean values for all of these thresholds, And all of the variants here, each of the percentiles are made available as well. And I'm going to run you through a couple of examples that might be helpful here. And I'll just highlight here too that only the full set version of this FLUXNet dataset includes all these variables. So when you download the FLUXNet data product, in most cases, you will get two versions. You will get the full set that has a complete list of all the variables, and the subset that has a shortened version of the dataset, only including key variables. So just keep an eye out for that when using the files. So why is it important to have these variants? What's causing us to add all these different versions and not just picking one and moving forward, right? And basically, there is a lot of variability of these thresholds. So this graph here is showing the U-star threshold in the x-axis and different and the distribution of U-star thresholds, right? And for each year, and this is all for the same site, and it's applying two different methods that we use to calculate the U-star threshold. And you can see there's even within a site, there is quite a bit of variability for this U-star threshold. So this is one of the key reasons why we put so much weight and have all these versions actually made available and distributed. So you can kind of look into the range of uncertainties that are arising from that filtering that we are applying. And just a different view of those thresholds. So the x-axis here is just a ranking, but the y-axis is showing the median U-star threshold, and the 25th and 75th percentiles are the error bars here for the thresholds that we are estimating. So each point is a different site. So this just gives you an idea of how different the conditions are for all of these different sites, and how it is really important to have this uncertainty taken into account when you're doing the analysis. So just going back to this graph, just for a little bit to highlight what I mean by the shortcut variable. So we generate this reference version of the fluxes that is what we believe is probably the most commonly useful version to be adopted. So if you're not sure which one to use, starting with the reference is a good bet. The reason for that is we are using this approach to calculate the best version of all of these iterations based on this model efficiency approach, which is basically what you see in this matrix here is how different each version of these U-star thresholds, in this case, actually with versions of NEE that was filtered using this U-star threshold, how different it is from all of the others. So basically, in the center here, you have the smallest difference, and because you're comparing the same to each other. But basically, what we do is we sum up this ranking of the differences, and we pick the one that is the closest version to all of the other versions. And we do this because if we were to use just the average, for instance, just the mean, this is also a version of NE that is produced. But if we were to use just the mean, we have quite a bit of smoothing that happens, and some of the variability that might be important for a lot of questions that someone is trying to ask and answer using this data could disappear. So by picking one of the instances that we are actually generating, we manage to maintain that variability, and we manage to assign the one that is actually closest to all of the other variations that we tried to process. I forgot to mention again, but if anyone has any questions at any point, please feel free to interrupt. It's totally fine to get into some details or some portions that might be unclear. please just put them in the chat or raise your hand. I'm happy to pause and take the questions. Okay, so what does this look in practice? So here are a couple of examples of what this uncertainty stemming from the U-star filtering will look like. So these are two sites, and this is showing the net ecosystem exchange for these two sites at a nearly scale. So each point here is the value for NE for that year. And you can see for the Heterogeneity site in Finland, the uncertainty that is coming from U-star, that is this shaded area around the shortcut versions, around the reference, the mean, and the median versions of NE is very small. So in this case, the U-star method is managing to find the thresholds in a very narrow area, and the impact that filtering using those thresholds have on NE is pretty small. So you have a pretty tight range of variability for NE. And now for Davos here, the story is a little bit different, right? There is quite a bit of uncertainty that is stemming from the U-star filtering. So the different versions of U-star are generating quite a wide range of values. This doesn't mean that there is something wrong or something right based on this variability. It's just how the conditions of turbulence at the site are impacting the product. So this doesn't have anything to, this range of values doesn't have anything to do with the quality of the data. But talking about quality, this is what is being shown at the bottom here. So these blue lines here are showing the percentage of data available, of good quality data available for each year. So you can see that there are a few gaps for a few of these years for these sites, and this is potentially another source of uncertainty. I will mention a little bit more about the quality flags in a little bit. And just mentioning the second part of the CO2 flux processing here. So when we do the partitioning of fluxes into ecosystem respiration and GPP, we actually recalculate all of these reference, mean, and median versions of each of these variables, right? So the reference NE will not be the same as the reference respiration, right? So these are all recalculated as we move forward. So we process all the versions of all the instances, and we recalculate the references and the means, medians, and all that. And this slide here is just to highlight that this is a second source of uncertainty that you should take into account when analyzing flux data. So in the blue lines here, you have the results from partitioning from using the daytime partitioning method. That's the method that uses respiration plus the light response curve to calculate basically GPP and respiration for the sites. And the orange colored lines are using the nighttime partitioning method, which basically uses the reference respiration at night and tries to propagate that throughout the day to estimate both respiration and GPP. So for some sites, there will be good agreement between the two partitioning methods, but others, the results will be quite different. And there are a number of reasons for that, and we're going to take a look at a couple. So just looking into a little bit more detail. So from the point of view of the processing, how the processing is working for the site, there are a few things that we can look at and estimate if the processing is working well or not for that site. And this case is an example where everything is working pretty well. So we have low uncertainty for NE, that's what you're seeing here. We have good quality gap filling. There aren't many very long gaps, except at the beginning and at the end, but that's basically sites that are getting started. That is pretty common to happen. And probably at the end, we didn't have the full year for this, so we had a little bit more uncertainty here as well. But the gap filling is looking good. There's not a lot of gaps, or the gaps are, we're able to fill the gaps with high confidence. And the U-star uncertainty was high, but the impact of that on NE and the uncertainties around respiration were not that high. And actually having a high uncertainty in U-star is actually a good thing, because we are sure that we are covering a good range of possibilities to estimate that threshold. And small differences in the partitioning that we had seen before. Now, this site is a little trickier, right? We have low U-star uncertainty. We also have good quality gap filling. We don't have many gaps that we are not able to fill with high confidence. But for this site, we had low U-star uncertainty. That means that the range of values for the U-star threshold that we estimated is not that wide. So we cannot be sure that this method is really working. The U-star threshold estimate is really doing its job. And we see further evidence of that in the partitioning results here. There are large differences in the partitioning. So for this site, some of the methods might not be working ideally. So this is something to keep in mind when using these data. We are trying to come up with this flow of evaluation for these sites, trying to give an indication of an easier indication of how these will behave. And I'll just pause here. I see a question. Let me just go through that. Okay, so the question is, in this context, what would be the worst case scenario to deal with? A site with significant wind direction and speed variability, or a site with heterogeneity in surface roughness lengths? That's a great question. So if you have a lot of variability from wind direction, you can actually deal with that by looking at the footprint. So we'll take a quick look at that in a little bit. So you can, if you really want, you can handle that by looking at the footprint and resolve some of that uncertainty. Now, a site that has heterogeneity on the surface, roughness lengths, that can be a little trickier, right? So if they are heterogeneous because the actual surface is permanently different, you're sampling different areas a lot of the time, then you could also try to look at that with the footprint, but that will probably mean that you will have to lose a lot of your data. Now, if the changes are happening because there is a change in the surface, leaves going out, leaves budding, so this changes the surface quite a bit, or there's snowfall events. Those are usually not very hard to deal with from the point of view of the crossing, because those are kind of marked events. So we can see those changes in the data, and the processing is equipped to deal with that in I should say most cases, obviously not all. There will be problems sometimes, but in most cases we have the code working to deal with that. And one thing that we do to handle some of that is to use two versions of these U-star threshold estimates. I didn't mention this here, but if you want to take a look at that in more detail, we have a continuous U-star version that is continuous throughout the entire record, and we have a variable U-star version that varies according to each year it's estimated again. So it is varying with the processing, with the long-term changes to the roughness conditions at the site. Hopefully that answered your question. Okay, great. Okay, so I will not go into details on this flow here, but the idea here is that we're trying to come up with a way that can allow us to consistently quantify how suitable a site is for an analysis or not, right? So we are trying to develop this identification method, and hopefully we'll manage to get a version of this ready and incorporate it into some of the products in the future. Okay, one other thing that I mentioned briefly, and I'll just touch very quickly here, is the quality flags. So almost all of the variables that we have touched in any way, that we processed, we applied any type of processing, they have an associated quality flag, right? And basically the quality flags are indicating if a data point was measured, in most cases, if a data point was measured, if it was gap filled, if we have high confidence on that gap filling or not. And we also make available these aggregated products, right? So we have the original resolution that's either half hourly or hourly, but we have the aggregations for daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly products as well. So here we are seeing the monthly and yearly products for, I forget which site is this, but it's just to highlight that for this site, there is a little bit of impact on the data availability and the data that we actually managed to fill with high confidence, right? So it is worth looking into these details, especially if you're doing an analysis with one or a small number of sites. So it's good to understand the exact conditions for that site. And the way to do that is just use these quality flags to filter data that were gap filled with low confidence, for instance, right? We have a list with all the documentation of these variables. And this is just an example for one of the variables and what that documentation looks like. Basically, this is the quality flag for the NEE with the variable U-star threshold, the reference NEE. And for the original resolution, half hourly, 0 means measured, we have a good quality gap fill, and it gets poorer as this number gets higher. For the higher aggregations, this is basically a fraction of of the values that we were able to, that were either measured or we were able to gap fill with good quality. And just note that for weekly to yearly resolutions here, this is an average from the daily data. So that might have an impact on how you filter your data. So just keep an eye out for that. And the details for the full set data product in the fluxnet.org website will have the details for that. One other point to mention, and this is something that we touched briefly, is how we should take into account footprints. So this is super important when you're combining flux data with remote sensing, and it is challenging to deal with this. So just a few examples here. I borrowed this figure from this paper that my colleague Hausen Chu published in 2021. This is a very extensive collaboration. There are lots more of footprints in the paper if you want to check it out, and it's a very good paper to document the impact and develop a more systematic way to assess homogeneity of a site and how much you should take into account the footprint when doing combinations with remote sensing data. I highly recommend you take a look at the paper. So basically, there is a lot of variability. This figure here is showing monthly average. So each isoline here is a monthly average for a full year of data for each of these sites. So some of these sites have fairly consistent footprints, but others vary through time, depending on the time of the year, depending on season, sometimes time of the day. They also have trends on which areas around the tower are being sampled. So the coordinate that you get for the tower is always the center of the tower, but keep in mind that you are actually potentially looking at the area around the tower, not exactly that single point. There is a shortcut that I will mention very briefly in the examples later. That is, if you have an ecosystem that is homogeneous enough, and what homogeneous enough means depends on what question you're trying to answer. But if it is homogeneous enough, you can just aggregate a bunch of pixels around the tower and kind of compensate for this effect. And if you want a more precise description of how to do that, Halson's paper is a perfect source of information. He did a very good analysis on how to quantify that heterogeneity. Okay, so very briefly, I see that I'm going quite longer than I had intended. I hope that's okay. I think we still have the full hour, right? It's okay if I run a little over. Okay, great. So I just wanted to run through a few examples moving into the remote sensing direction. I will use here NDVI, which is one of the most widely used remote sensing products. So for folks that are familiar with remote sensing applications, this potentially will not be super exciting, but I will connect that with some of the flux data that we've been looking at and see how that works. And the place where I got this data is using this tool, this global substat web service tool, which I highly recommend. Even though there are some challenges interpreting what the data looks like and how to use the data, it's super thorough, and it's very easy to get started acquiring a lot of these data products. Okay, so let's take a look at this NDVI product for a couple of sites and take a look at a few things that might be important when you're doing these analyses. So this is a Grassland site. This is data from a Grassland site in Oklahoma. And what you see here in the NDVI time series is a single pixel, and I'm using the center of the tower. And here we are looking at the weekly aggregate of GPP for that site at the bottom here. So this is coming from the Flux Tower. This is coming from MODIS, from MODIS Terra, MODIS Aqua, and various products. So just different generations of NDVI products that are supposed to be very compatible. So we can start seeing that there is a fairly clean time series for Flux, not a lot of gaps that we should really be worried about. We only have 2 years of data, just 2005, 2006. So we need to keep that in mind. And in this case, there's no overlap with peers, so there's no way for us to look at that data. So just taking a look at what GPP, what fraction of GPP can be explained by NDVI. So obviously this is a very loaded question, but I just wanted to have, this is a fun example for us to walk through. So here, the two plots here are showing GPP in the x-axis and NDVI in the y-axis. The one on the left is for Terra, the one on the right is for Aqua. These are the two satellites carrying these MODIS instruments and generating MODIS products. And the two colors in the plot are just the two versions of the partitioning that we use to generate GPP. So it's the nighttime and the daytime method in blue and red here. And I'm just doing a very simple linear regression here to try to understand how well these things are correlated, right? So in this case, we have some agreement with NEE. Both Terra and Aqua data products are fairly good comparisons. There are some funky areas here that we should take care when analyzing, but I'll get into that in just a little bit. Now, this is just a variant to show you that little trick that I had mentioned of just start aggregating some pixels around the tower. If the ecosystem is homogeneous enough, you can do that and increase how much signal you can get out of the remote sensing product. So in this case, and on the top here, these are the two graphs that we were looking at before for Terra and Aqua, and at the bottom, and this is just a single pixel. And the bottom ones are the same, Terra and Aqua, but for multiple pixels. I'm aggregating 4 pixels close to the tower, basically. So we improve a little bit our relationships by doing that for both Terra and Aqua. So you see the R² bumped a little bit. So this is one trick that you can use sometimes, and you can evaluate if that's a good idea or not based on the homogeneity. Looking at another side, this is a deciduous broadleaf forest, and it's a very long time series, so we'll have plenty of opportunities to compare to different products. But there are a few more gaps that we were not able really to fill with high confidence. So this is something that we should keep in mind when doing these comparisons. And here we see some of these effects, right? There are other things going on here, but I'll just go through a couple of examples here. So the agreement with Aqua and Virus seems to be a little worse than it is with Terra. So what that tells us potentially is that there are effects of time of the day that the data has been collected by these satellites and how well they might relate with these products. That might be one explanation for this. There are obvious artifacts in this plot, but I'm not going to go through them right now. I just wanted to point out that we have this kind of saturation effect of this relationship between GPP and MODIS. And we could think that this is potentially because we are just doing this very simple relationship, we are missing something like a light use efficiency effect or potentially other stressors that are impacting the ecosystem. So this is kind of a sign that this relationship, it has a limited explaining power for this question that we're trying to answer, right? So this is just one thing that is noticeable here. One more site, if you remember, this is the site that had a lot of differences between the daytime and the nighttime partitioning methods. So when we start looking at this resolution, at a weekly resolution to make this compatible with the MODIS data collections, these differences are not as pronounced. So for this case, for asking a question at this resolution, those differences between the two partitioning methods will not matter as much, right? We can still get good agreement and try to understand how much is explained. So there we have it. This is one thing that we considered earlier that could have, if you're doing a carbon budget, that might be a big problem. If you're trying to explain variability at a weekly scale, maybe not. One last example, I think this is the last one, is, and this is a little different. So I should have changed the colors, but didn't quite manage. So what we're seeing here is not daytime and nighttime anymore. In blue, we have the reference daytime, and in orange, we have the percentiles. So on the right, top right plot, we have the 5th percentile for GPP, and at the bottom here, bottom right, we have the 95th percentile for GPP. So we can see that even though the agreement, the explanation power for these two is fairly comparable. Actually, I take that back. This is the exact opposite, right? This is a big change in the explanation power. So if you go to the more lenient version of the U-star filtering, where you're leaving most of the data intact, the agreement is much worse, right? When you're comparing the reference to the 5th percentile, that drops quite a bit. But when you're going towards the kind of stricter filtering, so when you're filtering a lot of the NE and U star values, the agreement is actually preserved a bit more. So this tells us that there is a range of GPP and GPU values that will be impacted here that we can take into account when analyzing these data. I had one more. Oh, okay. So this is something that I just mentioned briefly. So just looking at some of the problems that some of the artifacts that we noticed, right? So if you look at some of these plots that I showed, there is a bit of a saturation for the values for GPP at 0 here, and there are points of saturation for NDVI as well, not saturation, sorry, where these values are kind of stuck at 0 and stuck at a value for NDVI. So a couple of ways to explain this. So these flat NDVI values are probably because these were gap-filled values. And I started out from the standard filtering of the NDVI products. I didn't really do any additional filtering myself. So the advice that I had on how to use the flux data, I didn't adopt that myself for the remote sensing data. So I suspect that doing that, we would resolve some of these issues. For the GPP values being 0 here, so we are using the weekly product, so it's the weekly average. And these are not really necessarily comparable with what the satellite is seeing. So one way to remedy that is to go back to the hourly resolution and pick the values that are around the time that the data collection happened for the satellite. So that you would that way you would have a more comparable condition for both the satellite collection and the tower measurement that is happening at that time. So just a little suggestion going forward there. And okay, and so just to wrap it up, so I used NDVI as an example here, but this is a very simple and widely used example. There are many other remote sensing measurements that can be directly or indirectly combined with flux data, and you can use that to calibrate, to validate, and benchmark all of these remote sensing measurements. And the main advantage is that you can take advantage of this very fine-grained temporal coverage that the flux data has to offer in these cases. And understanding a little bit more about the flux data product, so what are the variables, how the quality flags work, how to filter the data, what are the processing steps and their impacts, will help you be more effective in using this data. And the same goes for remote sensing products, right? If you understand better how the acquisition works, how the data sources are used in how different data sources are used in the processing and generation of products, the effects of different resolutions, all those things have an impact. So understanding those are helpful in this case. And time invested in learning about all these details is always time saved in answering questions from viewers. So I always recommend that. And with that, I will wrap up, and I think we might have a little bit of time for questions if anyone has them. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilberto. Yes, so we have some time for Q&A or discussion. So if you have any, please go ahead. You can turn on the microphone and talk, or you can leave your question in the chat. Thank you.
Hi, Gilberto. Thank you for the question. I'm Igor from University of Twente. I would like to know what's your suggestion if I work with this quality flux. For example, do you just leave everything that is 0 and 1, or so what? What is exactly that I have to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So unfortunately, there isn't an answer that's one size fits all, right? So the main consideration that you should have is what is the impact that a potential subset of gap-filled variables that you're not very confident in will have on your analysis, right? And you have to balance that against the fact that you have that you would have gaps in the data that you're analyzing. So you wouldn't be able to use aggregate products, for instance. You can't generate reliable aggregates without doing that gap filling. So this is kind of a balance. But my recommendation is to always look at plots like these ones that we were looking at, right? So for instance, this one, if you just generate a time series plot of what that variable looks like, and you see at the same time what the quality flags are for that period that you're interested in analyzing, you can kind of see the impact of this poor quality gap filling that we have there. In many cases, us not being confident on the gap filling doesn't mean that it is a bad gap filling, right? It just means that the method that we are using is a little less strict. So it will allow conditions that are not optimal to kind of filter through the data set and show up. So my recommendation would be to try to look at these and see what the impact is. And I understand that if you're doing that for a lot of sites, generating the visualization might be tricky. So usually what I try to do is quantify the amount of missing data and compare what the missing data looks like when compared to comparable periods around the gap or comparable conditions, and just try to evaluate. So I basically, what I'll do is generate a mask on the quality flag. One data set will be just a measured and good quality. One will be all the gap filled. And I will basically just compare these two and generate a metric from that. If they are too different, then probably the gap filling, the poor confidence gap filling, is not something I should be using. But yeah, you have some options, but it's not 100% the same answer for everyone, for sure. Thank you for that question. It's important to look into that.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. Yeah, it's nice. I will consider coining some metric in your way. I think.
Sounds good. Any other questions? While folks are thinking, I will recommend that you join us again for next week's seminar. Nicola has been analyzing remote sensing and flux data for a while now. I'm sure it will be super fun.
I think it was a good idea to divide the session into these two parts that you gave so much informative information today.
Yeah, I went over quite a bit, but I was more relaxed with the content too. I kept a lot of things that I would probably not have added here. So I'm glad that it worked out to share all of this.
Sure. Is there any other questions or discussion you want to have?
So Christian is telling me about this data visualization tool that is available. Christian, would you mind posting the link to folks here? So this is a data visualization tool for the UNEFlux data set. And you can actually explore. Very cool. Thank you, Christian. That's a great idea. You can explore all of the data that's available from the UNEFlux portal and generate some visualizations of the time series, of distributions, and all sorts of fun stuff. So check out that tool. Okay, we have one more here. Can you cite some examples of the FLUXNet data for calibration, remote sensing, ecosystem fluxes estimations? Okay, yeah, there's a lot of efforts. So there are a couple that we were directly involved in the calibration process. So there was the SMAT mission, that was the soil moisture remote sensing product, and I think it had some trouble a little after it was launched, but we did have a lot of flux towers that provided kind of near real-time data directly to the team to do validation of their soil remote sensing soil moisture estimates. So that worked out pretty well. I think I don't know if Josh is here, but Josh led some work on calibrating evapotranspiration measurements from ecostrats. So I think that was a super cool work as well. So that was directly using flux data to do some of this validation, calibration and validation. I'm sure there are many other examples. I'm just not really coming up with more now, but there are plenty of situations where these can be used in this way. And afterwards as well for the analyses, right? A lot of people have been combining flux data with remote sensing products for a long time. There is a whole network founded around that. SpecNet is founded around this idea of combining flux data and remote sensing data. So yes, lots to explore there. This is a fun area for sure. Thank you for the question, Andrea.
Okay, I think it's almost time to wrap up. So if we don't have any more questions, then yeah, thank you so much for Gilberto. This is really great presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And please remember to join us next Friday for part 2, the analysis of remote sensing, and we will send you another Zoom link next Thursday. So with that, take care and see you next time. Then have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.